Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being in the session. Also, thanks for these great speakers and the presentations that we've just heard. These presentations are open for discussion. As you have heard, and as you know from the previous sessions, you can ask your questions in the chat. I am looking at it right now. I'm not seeing questions yet, so I'll take this opportunity to ask a few questions myself. And Sébastien, I was, since this is on, indeed, as you already mentioned, and also meant to be about tuberculosis, you mentioned two drugs for tuberculosis specifically, one, the sutezolid, on which there is already a public health license. You are, as I understood, negotiating bedaquiline. Could you give some more detail on this? Because I think bedaquiline is now being used, or at least is being recommended for large-scale use in multi-drug resistant TB, also in HIV infected TB patients, people living with HIV with tuberculosis. How do you see this?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. That's a very important question. I think the use of bedaquiline, has increasingly become important, and since 2 years, MPP has prioritized the drug for in-licensing. We haven't been successful yet. We are trying to make the case for this to happen. But I think what's important is that the role being reinforced by the latest guidelines makes this a very central drug for where we may need more affordable options, still quality assured, but also more security of supply. We've seen with COVID that the diversity of supply is really important. And if we want to move forward with addressing MDR-TB, that's going to be quite key.
Thank you, Sébastien. There is a question from the floor by Mireille Palankabuku, and that is for Dereck. And I'm reading out aloud: TB-AMR represent 1/4 of all antimicrobial resistance. Shorter course of anti-TB can improve adherence. However, during this COVID-19 pandemic, the TB program has been impacted negatively. What are the strategies that the WHO has suggested to counteract antimicrobial resistance in tuberculosis?
I think the big things are, again, as I've said a few times, better use of the tools that we currently have. And that, again, is diagnostics and then keeping people on therapy and ensuring that they complete their treatments. I think it's also very important that, and COVID has massively affected this, and I think most people accept the fact that this has pushed us back quite a lot, and we are going to really have to get back to where we were before. I know in South Africa, for example, there have been a lot of people who actually stopped therapy, largely because they were scared to go to clinics. And also the number of people being diagnosed with TB dropped radically. So you're quite right to say that this has had a big impact and could well drive antimicrobial resistance. In terms of WHO-specific strategies, I'm not terribly sure what they are advocating at the moment, other than getting back to where we were and improving on it. But yeah, I think that's really my view on that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dereck. I have another question here from the floor by Caesar Magumba, who says he is excited about the 4-month drug-resistant TB therapy. I think the 4-month therapy is about drug-susceptible TB, if I'm not mistaken, Dereck. But then the question is, I believe it will require high adherence levels and possibly treatment from the hospital. In that clinical trial that evaluated this therapy, were patients strictly treated from hospital, or was ambulatory treatment part of that? And before you answer that, Dereck, I would also take the opportunity to put this question in a different way to Sébastien, because this 4-month treatment includes moxifloxacin and rifabutin, which I think are not drugs that are easily available in sub-Saharan Africa. So perhaps you could give your views on whether the medicines patent pool would have an interest in those drugs as well. But let's first ask Dereck about the details of that trial as far as you have them.
They were ambulatory patients. They weren't hospitalized, and I don't think there would be absolutely no need to hospitalize people with TB. I think in essence, you are looking at treating them in exactly the same way they're treated on the 6-month regimen, but only for a 4-month period of time, which I think improves adherence massively, and is much easier to follow people up for a shorter period of time and ensure they're on their treatment for that period of time.
Thank you for that answer, Dereck. Sébastien, over to you.
Yes, that's a very good question. I think there's, voluntary licensing can really bring solutions for patented medicines, but in the case of moxifloxacin and rifabutin, I think these, as far as I remember, these medicines are not patented anymore, which makes it a bit more tricky to increase access through the licensing model. That said, there are market-shaping initiatives that should and could probably address that in terms of making sure that more players are in the game, and so their true generic competition can take place.
Thank you. There is another question from the floor by Joseph Baluku, who asks a question to Dereck. What progress is there towards a single regimen for both DRTB, drug-resistant TB, and drug-susceptible TB, which I think has become known as the magic bullet regimen? Is there any news around this, Dereck?
Not that I am aware of. I think that we're probably still quite a way off any sort of magic bullet opportunity. So, yeah, no, not in the immediate future.
Sébastien, would you have any insights on this, or?
Well, I think from our perspective, we've been interested in modeling what licensing could do with new drugs, and we've certainly internally looked at the impact for bedaquiline, for example, in terms of savings for MDR-TB. But when we looked at application of bedaquiline for DSTB, for example, coming out of the BPAM-Z regimen, for example, that could give interesting answers in the coming years. What was obvious was that to be able to use this in first line, we would need to see massive price reductions to compete with what's already out there, and that's much cheaper.
Thank you, Sébastien. There are currently no other questions from the floor, but I have one for you, Dereck. I know the vaccines are close to your heart, and you're very much into what is currently happening with, I think, the most promising candidate that we have at the moment, which is M72. The trial that is the phase 3 that is now phase 3 trial that's now being designed. To what extent are people living with HIV are they included, and will we have sufficient data out of that to say anything to say sufficient about efficacy and safety in people living with HIV?
So I think starting very soon, COVID might have delayed it. There is actually going to be a trial in people living with HIV using M72, and that's really a safety and immunogenicity study, so it won't be done in a large number of participants. And I'm not involved in the design of that study, and I can't recall how many participants it will have, but it'll be hundreds. And again, I'm not involved in the design of the phase 3 study, but I do understand that it will include people with living with HIV as well. And again, I can't give you an idea of what the numbers are, but it's an essential group of people that we need this data, and so they'd have to be included. And I think one of the things with TB vaccines as well is we tend to include people living with HIV late in our clinical trials. We want evidence that the vaccine actually is doing something, in other words, that it meets a biological proof of principle before we actually start enrolling people living with HIV. But it is something that is essential, and we should be probably doing a bit earlier in the development programs as well.
Thank you, Dereck. Now that we are discussing vaccines, the question that's probably on everyone's mind, Sébastien, is there a role for the MPP in COVID vaccines and licensing those, or is that entirely with COVAX and other initiatives?
Yeah, thanks. Important question indeed. I think the first part of this answer is the expansion of the MPP's mandate. So we've made ourselves available to support licensing for any health technologies out there. That said, we have been doing in parallel an expansion beyond small molecule medicines study for our work. And what turns out is that we may be able to contribute in biologics. Vaccines, we're not sure yet. We're still exploring. And diagnostics is something much more for the future. And to reply with regards to COVAX, I think that the COVID-19 vaccine, what's really moving forward mostly at the moment is through COVAX and other commercial manufacturing agreements to expand the scale, but there is no licensing really that's seriously moving forward. That said, MPP is more actively involved in the treatment space. So we're really looking at all the pipeline. We've added a number of medicines on our database for others to use, and also we're trying to see what role we could have. But it's a very rapidly evolving space, and what is quite apparent is that the nice, very fast timelines we've seen, for example, with DTG, with generic access, would be totally unreasonable with COVID. If we say, we would have a generic on the market in 2-3 years, it would be really too late. So the considerations are quite different, but we're actively looking at this.
Yeah. Thank you. Dereck, you already mentioned the impact of COVID-19 also on R&D for tuberculosis. And you mentioned that there are some lessons to be learned. To what extent do you think that the massive acceleration that we've seen in R&D for COVID-19 vaccines could tell us something about how we could potentially take a different approach to R&D for a TB vaccine? Or is there no lesson to be learned here?
Oh, I think there are probably quite a few lessons to be learned. The biggest lesson to be learned is funding. They got enormous amounts of funding, which really accelerates. I mean, we really do struggle for funding in TB vaccine development. So I think that's one lesson to learn. I think the other one, is, it was mentioned at the Union conference as well, is that the politicians have become very aware of the effect that disease can have on the economy and all the rest. And there's always been a burden on the economy for TB, but I don't think anyone's really evaluated that properly. So I think if people do become aware of that, again, you might have the political will there. I think in terms of R&D as well, I think we tend to not work as closely with the regulators as they work with on the coronavirus vaccines. Mm-hmm. And we might well be able to take shorter cuts. But that said, TB is a very different beast from coronavirus. Coronavirus, the incidence is probably higher, and also it's a very acute illness compared to tuberculosis. So when we recruit people into a study like 3,500 M72 study, we're looking for a very small number of endpoints, about 23 endpoints, and it takes us 3 years to accumulate those endpoints. So I think we're never going to be able to do it as quickly as the coronavirus group did. But certainly, I think there are many lessons to be learned. And I think also with the new platforms that came through, for example, mRNA vaccines as well. I mean, these are sort of things that we should really now be looking at in TB, which we've sort of not really done very much up until now in terms of TB vaccines. But I do think that is one area where we should be really looking at, because I think that could massively accelerate R&D for TB. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's an optimistic message then. There's another question from the floor. I think that's also for you, Dereck. This is about from Victoria Munyama, which is about the Fourmonth TB course, so what came out of the trial. And she says, in Namibia, we are still on the 6 months starting course. I think everyone is. And she says, not sure if I missed it, but has it already started? If so, where? Or is it still in testing phase? So what are the prospects for this shorter regimen in the short run?
Okay, the results of the study have just been reported a few weeks, maybe a month ago. So we're in the very early phases of this. But I would sincerely hope that this starts getting rolled out quite early. And I mean, that probably goes through various WHO processes and all the rest before it gets recommended. So I am not sure where it is available, if it's available anywhere at the moment. But the results were only announced very, very recently. But I would hope, given the importance of this, that actually it does get rolled out quite quickly.
Thank you. And I think with that we should stop. I get a cue from the organizers that it's time for tea break. Sébastien, Dereck, thank you very much for your wonderful presentations and for this discussion. Everyone from the floor, thank you very much for your questions and from listening. I hope you'll enjoy your tea break and see you back after the tea break. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, thanks.
Bye.